The morning rain had cleared by the time Bernice Tawaya made her way down Bloor Street, the sidewalk still damp beneath her sensible flats, the air carrying that particular October freshness that Torontonians know to take seriously because it will not last. She was 66 years old, recently retired after 31 years, as a registered nurse at St. Michael's Hospital, and she moved through the world with the unhurried confidence of someone who had seen enough genuine emergencies to know which ordinary moments required no alarm at all. She did not know, in that easy morning hour, that two people inside the Bridgecroft Center had already looked at her through a glass panel as she crossed the street and made a decision about who she was before she had even reached the door. She did not know that 40 minutes away, in a corner office on Bay Street, her daughter was closing a laptop and reaching for her blazer, unaware that the morning had already set two separate clocks moving toward the same floor of the same building. But the story cannot begin with what was coming. It has to begin with Bernice, because a woman like her deserved to be known before she was wronged. She had not driven downtown. She rarely did anymore, preferring the familiarity of the subway from Scarborough, the way a city revealed itself differently on foot than it ever did from behind glass. The Bloor Line West, a change at Yonge, 8 blocks on foot in the October air. By the time she reached Bridgecroft, her cheeks were flushed and her spirits were easy. She was looking for a silk scarf for her church friend Dorothy's 75th birthday, which was 4 days away, and she had not yet found anything that matched what she had in mind for a woman she had known for 40 years. The morning had started, as her mornings always did, with ritual. She rose before the sky had fully decided on its color, brewed coffee in the ceramic pot that had belonged to her late husband, and read the first chapter of whatever book was sitting on her nightstand. That week, it was a biography of a Trinidadian poet whose work she had loved since her 20s, and whose name she sometimes mentioned to the younger nurses at the community health clinic in Scarborough, where she still volunteered 2 mornings a week, long after any professional obligation to do so had expired. She dressed slowly, with the same deliberate care her mother had modeled for her 50 years earlier. She gathered her canvas tote bag and her reading glasses, which she pushed up into her silver-streaked hair almost immediately and then forgot about entirely for the rest of the day. At the clinic, the receptionist had waved her through without a word needing to be exchanged, because they had been doing this long enough to have their own language. An elderly man in the waiting room who came every Thursday for blood pressure checks had held up 2 fingers when he saw her. His way of saying things were the same as last week, and therefore fine. She stayed for 2 hours, helped an anxious mother fill out intake forms, sat with a man named Clarence, who had recently been diagnosed with something serious, and who, as far as Bernice could tell, simply needed someone to sit across from him and not rush. Before she left, the clinic director pressed her arm and told her they were putting together a fundraising dinner in November, and that Bernice's name on the invitation committee would mean more to donors in this part of the city than any corporate sponsor they could name. Bernice waved the idea away with characteristic briskness, the way she waved away any suggestion that what she did required recognition, and stepped out into the damp morning to catch the subway. She arrived at Bridgecroft just before 11. The store was mid-century in the bones, but had been renovated into a carefully considered version of contemporary airy elegance. Polished floors, curated displays, staff trained to project a warmth that was meant to suggest approachability, but which, in practice, was extended more fluently to some customers than to others. The scarves were on the 2nd floor, near the perfume counters, arranged on a circular display with quiet precision. Bernice studied them with the same methodical attention she had always brought to decisions worth making carefully. She lifted a burgundy piece and felt the weight of the silk between her fingers. She held a forest green one to the light to assess the depth of its color. She was looking for something in amber or warm ochre, something that would suit Dorothy's complexion and satisfy Dorothy's strong preference against anything she described as fussy. After several minutes, she found it. amber silk with a narrow gold border, folded along its crease with the slightly excessive care of something that knew it was expensive. She picked it up and began moving toward the payment counter. She had not noticed Piers Holloway, watching her from near the escalator. She had not needed to notice him because she had done nothing that required her to be alert to surveillance. Piers was 37, the floor supervisor for Bridgecroft's second level, a man who had developed over several years a particular style of authority that depended almost entirely on the confidence of his delivery rather than any actual foundation beneath it. He had been watching Bernice since she stepped off the escalator, and in the 5 minutes she had spent at the scarf display, he had already reached a conclusion that nothing she had done had produced. Beside him, Troy Beckett, 24 years old, 3 months into a security rotation, still learning whose judgment to defer to, watched Bernice the same way Piers did, because that was the signal that had been given, and he had not yet developed enough certainty in himself to consider whether the signal was right. Together they crossed the floor with the deliberate pace of men who have already decided how the encounter will go before it has begun. Bernice noticed them, approaching the way she noticed most things, with a small, precise attention that required no visible reaction. She continued toward the counter. They stepped directly into her path. "Ma'am." Pierre's voice carried the particular flatness of a person who uses courtesy words as performance rather than intent. "I need you to step aside for a moment." Bernice stopped. She looked at him with the composed, patient attention she had spent 31 years calibrating. "Is there a problem?" she asked. He told her there had been a report of merchandise being concealed in the accessory section, and that he would need to inspect her bag before she could continue. He offered no description of who had made the report. He cited no specific behavior he had observed. He presented the demand as though its reasonableness were self-evident, and her compliance were merely the remaining formality. Bernice's expression did not change. "I haven't concealed anything," she said, in the same level tone. "I've been at the scarf display for 5 minutes selecting a birthday gift. I'm happy to show you what's in my bag, but I'd like to understand first what was observed that raised a concern." It was a reasonable question, the precise question any person with knowledge of their rights would ask. Piers heard it the way certain men hear the word no, as an affront to something they considered settled. He told her that her attitude was making the situation more complicated. He did not answer her question. Troy moved to her left side, completing the familiar geometry of enclosure. The positioning was less a formal protocol than a habit, a physical language that meant your options have narrowed. Nearby, a woman at the jewelry counter had gone very still. A man pushing a stroller slowed without fully stopping, caught between the instinct to keep moving and the reluctance to look away from something that clearly should not be happening. A young woman near the escalator lifted her phone, then lowered it slightly, not putting it away, only lowering it. "I'll open my bag," Bernice said, with the same measured composure, "but I want to note that I'm doing so voluntarily, not because a legitimate reason has been provided." She set her tote on the nearest display surface and opened it herself, holding it where both men could see clearly. A transit pass, her phone in a soft case, a folded reusable bag, a small packet of tissues, nothing else. She had not taken a single item from any display in the store because she had not done so. Piers stared into the bag longer than the contents required. Something passed between him and Troy in the silence that followed. The particular look of two men who have arrived at a corner they cannot back out of cleanly and have decided to go deeper rather than admit they went wrong. Piers told her he needed to review security footage before she could leave. He told her she would need to wait in the back office. He spoke the words with the same manufactured authority he had used throughout, as though confidence alone were a substitute for cause. Bernice said, calmly and precisely, that she had no obligation to go anywhere, that her bag had been shown to contain nothing belonging to the store, and that if he intended to detain her, he would need to state the grounds on which he was doing so. Piers reached forward and put his hand on her arm. She pulled back, not in aggression, but in the simple reflex of a person touched without invitation. In that small motion, Troy stepped forward and gripped her upper arm with a force entirely disproportionate to anything she had done. Her foot caught the base of the display case beside her, and she stumbled sideways, catching herself with one hand on the glass surface, her wrist bending at an angle that sent a quick, bright pain up through her forearm. The amber scarf fell to the floor. The woman at the jewelry counter said something sharp. The man with the stroller turned back fully, no longer hesitating. The young woman near the escalator did not lower her phone again. An older couple standing near the handbag display went completely still, the woman's hand finding her husband's sleeve without either of them speaking. Somewhere near the perfume counter, a teenager whispered something to her friend. The floor had arrived at that particular, held-breath quality that a space takes on when the people within it have all understood, at the same moment, that something has just occurred which should not have occurred, and which cannot be undone. Troy stepped back. His face had changed entirely. The practiced imitation of Piers's authority had cracked into something younger and far less certain, the expression of a 24-year-old who has just understood the precise weight of what he has done and who will carry that weight, in some form, for a long time. Bernice straightened herself against the display case. Her wrist was throbbing with a persistence that told her it was something more than bruised. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She stood with the gathered composure of a woman who had been in rooms where things went wrong for 31 years and who knew the difference between a moment that required panic and one that required absolute stillness. "That hurt," she said. 2 words, plainly, in the tone of a person making a record rather than an accusation. She reached into her tote with her uninjured hand and found her phone. She dialed the number that she had dialed hundreds of times over 41 years, for reasons that had ranged from the trivial to the profound, and which she now dialed because her daughter had told her, when she first went back to volunteering after the retirement, to call the moment anything felt genuinely wrong. It connected on the second ring. "Mum." The voice was immediate, already listening. Bernice said what had happened. She said it clearly, without embellishment, in the order it had occurred, the way she had always reported the things worth reporting. She said she was standing on the second floor near the scarf display. She said her wrist was sore, and she thought it might need looking at. She said she was all right. 3 seconds of silence. "Don't say another word to them," her daughter said. "I'm coming." Soon Tawaya was 41 years old and had been running her own company since she was 26. She had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment on Lawrence Avenue in Scarborough, had put herself through the University of Waterloo on scholarships and overnight shifts at a 24-hour pharmacy, and had built Volwolter from a 3-person fintech startup into a company that employed 4,000 people across 5 Canadian cities. She had a reputation in the technology sector for a particular quality of attention, the kind that read a situation faster than most people could describe it, and made decisions in the space of a breath that others spent weeks deliberating over. She was not someone who made announcements about herself. She had learned early, in a small apartment, where resources were counted carefully, that the things worth doing rarely needed advance declaration. That morning, at 9 o'clock, Volter's acquisition of the Larson Retail Group had officially closed. It was a $340 million transaction, 7 months in the making, and it had made Soon the majority stakeholder of a company that owned Bridgecroft Center and 14 other retail properties across the country. She had attended a brief press event, shaken several hands, signed what needed signing, and gone directly to a meeting on Bay Street that she had been preparing for all week. She walked out of that meeting without explanation when her phone showed her mother's name. Her assistant Glennis, who had worked beside her for 9 years and could read the quality of her silences the way a sailor reads weather, simply gathered the relevant documents and said she would handle the rescheduling. Soon drove herself. She reached Bridgecroft in 12 minutes. She came through the main entrance in a charcoal blazer and dark trousers, her pace measured in the particular way that focused people move. Not hurried, but deliberate, as though the space were arranging itself around her, rather than the other way around. She took the escalator to the second floor. Shoppers who did not know her felt something shift slightly in the air as she passed, the way a room sometimes registers a change in pressure before anyone can account for why. The scene on the second floor was watchful and tense. A small cluster of onlookers had not dispersed. Piers stood with his clipboard, his earlier confidence having curdled into something more brittle in the time since the fall. Troy was several feet away, no longer positioned with any purpose, simply standing in the way a person stands when they no longer know what they are meant to be doing. A constable from the nearest station had arrived and was reviewing Bernice's identification with the careful, neutral manner of someone who has already assessed a situation and is completing a process that clearly should never have been initiated in the first place. Bernice stood near the display case, with her canvas tote held against her chest and her injured wrist pressed lightly to her side. She looked tired, not frightened, not undone, simply tired in the specific way that comes, not from physical exhaustion, but from having been required, once again, to justify her own dignity to strangers who assumed the right to decide it wasn't theirs to protect. Soon crossed the floor to her mother without rushing. She crouched beside her and took the injured hand gently in both of her own, turning it carefully to look at the wrist. "Let me see," she said quietly, directly, the way she had always spoken to her mother, without preamble, because Bernice had raised her to mean what she said. Bernice looked at her daughter's face and found in it what she had always found there. A seriousness that had been present since childhood, the particular seriousness of someone who had understood early that the world was not always arranged fairly and had decided, equally early, that she would arrange what she could. "I'm all right, baby," Bernice said. "My wrist needs looking at, but I'm all right." Soon held her mother's hand for a moment. Then she stood. She turned and faced Piers Holloway. "Tell me your name and your position here," she said. Her voice was quiet, quieter, if anything, than her ordinary speaking voice. The particular quiet of someone who requires information and nothing else. He straightened his shoulders by reflex. "Ma'am, I'm the floor supervisor, and this is still an active." "Your name," Soon said. He told her. She said it once, without inflection, in the tone of a person committing something to memory. Then she withdrew her phone from her blazer pocket and placed a call that lasted under a minute. She did not raise her voice during it. She did not identify herself by name, only recited a short sequence of internal reference numbers in a tone that was wholly flat and without drama, and ended by asking that Larson's legal counsel and the incoming board chair be notified immediately of an incident at the Bridgecroft location requiring their attention. She returned the phone to her pocket. "The Larson Retail Group acquisition closed at 9 o'clock this morning," she said, looking at Piers with the measured clarity of someone who has no interest in the theatrical value of what they are about to say, and every interest in its being understood precisely. "That means this store and everyone currently employed in it work for a company in which I hold majority ownership. That woman is my mother. She came here to buy a birthday present for a friend. She has been physically handled by a member of your security staff, and she has injured her wrist. She was given no legitimate basis for a search of her belongings, and no evidence has been produced at any point to support detaining her." Piers said nothing. Beside him, Troy had gone entirely still in the way a person goes still when the ground beneath them has shifted and is not shifting back. The constable closed his notebook. What followed moved the way things do when an institution suddenly understands the full weight of what it has done. The district manager arrived within the hour, pale and apologetic in the way of a man whose apologies had always come after the fact. Bernice's wrist was examined at a nearby clinic, a hairline fracture, confirmed by imaging, small but real and entirely preventable. Legal counsel reached the scene before afternoon. The store's own surveillance footage, reviewed within hours, showed everything with the same unambiguous clarity the onlookers had known from the moment they witnessed it. Bernice examining merchandise, returning it to its proper place on the display, selecting a single scarf, moving toward the till. At no point, concealing, pocketing, or behaving in any manner consistent with what had been alleged against her. Piers Holloway was suspended before the end of that business day. Troy Beckett followed. Following a formal review that Soon's legal team participated in directly, both were terminated within the week. The constable's incident report left the department no room for ambiguity about what it contained. The story spread through the city with the speed that certain stories travel when they contain too much truth to stay quiet. The surveillance footage was eventually released by the new board leadership, and it was accompanied by the footage the teenager near the escalator had captured on her phone. Angles slightly different from the store's own cameras, details entirely consistent, filmed with the steady hand of a young woman who had been frightened and had kept recording anyway. Several news outlets ran the story. Letters arrived at Bernice's home in Scarborough from people she had never met, from across the city and beyond it, some offering support, others simply saying that they had seen the footage and wanted her to know that it had mattered to them. She read every letter. She set aside a pile to answer personally when she had the time. Sohn declined every media request. She had never needed the world to know what she was doing in order to keep doing it, and she had no interest in making the worst afternoon her mother had experienced in many years into a story about herself. A written statement from Walter's communications office confirmed the acquisition, confirmed the incident, and confirmed that the company's new leadership accepted full responsibility for the failures of care and judgment that had produced it. The statement was 11 sentences. It did not contain the words unfortunate or isolated, both of which had been suggested and neither of which was accurate. Bernice spent the following week at her kitchen table in Scarborough, thinking about what she wanted to do next. She thought about Dorothy's birthday, which had arrived during the intervening days, and for which she had ordered the amber scarf online, because returning to Bridgecroft was not something she was ready to do yet, and might not be ready to do for some time. She thought about Clarence from the clinic, whose diagnosis was serious and who was not getting better. She thought about the older couple who had stood at the handbag display with their hands touching, which she had decided was its own kind of witness, quiet and present and honest. She thought about 31 years at St. Michael's, about the hundreds of patients who had come through her ward with the specific vulnerability of people who are sick and frightened and entirely dependent on the judgments of strangers. She thought about what she had always understood without needing it said aloud, that the difference between a hospital ward that helped people and one that harmed them came down entirely to whether the people working in it had been asked, regularly and seriously, to think of the human beings in their care as fully human. She wrote her proposal over 4 evenings, with the same methodical care she had always brought to documentation that mattered. A month after the incident, she stood before a gathering of approximately 200 people in the community center on Markham Road in Scarborough. Neighbors, nurses, parents, teachers, a few journalists, 2 city councilors, and in the back row, in a plain dark jacket, very quiet, her daughter. Bernice began not with anger but with memory. She described her first week as a nursing student, nearly 40 years earlier, when an instructor had told her cohort that the most important thing they would ever learn was not a procedure or a protocol, but a habit of seeing, of looking at the person in the bed and understanding them as a complete person with a history and a context and a dignity that existed entirely apart from whatever had brought them there. She said she had tried to practice that habit every working day for 31 years, and that it had made her a better nurse than any formal training she had received. "What happened to me in that store," she said, her voice carrying evenly across the room, "was the opposite of that habit. It was the habit of not seeing, of deciding who someone is before they have said a single word or done a single thing. She paused. I am not angry about that. I am tired of it. Those are different feelings, and I think it matters to say which one is which. The room was quiet, in the way that rooms go quiet when they recognize something true. Near the center, a woman pressed her teenage daughter's hand between both of hers without looking at her. Near the back, two uniformed officers, who had come without being certain why, stood with their eyes lowered, unable to meet the gaze of the woman the room had gathered to honor. Bernice described her proposal plainly and practically, the way she described anything she had thought about carefully. She wanted to see the habit of genuine seeing brought into retail and service environments across the city, not as a punitive measure, not as a compliance checkbox, but as a real and ongoing conversation between institutions and the communities they served. She described what that could look like in practice. Structured sessions, community elders, consistent follow-through, an actual review rather than a one-time event. She said that she had spent her career in an institution that had imperfectly and incompletely, but genuinely, tried to ask that question of itself. She believed other institutions could do the same if they were held to it. Both city councilors made commitments before the evening was over. Soon, who had spent the previous weeks in quiet conversation with the Larson Board's incoming chair, confirmed the following morning that the company would fund the pilot program across all Canadian properties, with an independent review at 18 months and a formal publication of results. The program was not given a name at the outset. Bernice said she preferred to wait and see what it became before deciding what to call it. Someone in the city's office gave it a name anyway, several weeks later, because administrative records require naming. They called it the Tawaya Standard. Bernice heard about this on a Tuesday evening in late November, sitting at the small table in her kitchen in Scarborough, across from her daughter, both of them holding cups of tea in the easy, particular quiet that belongs only to people who have eaten most of their significant meals together. She turned the name over in her mind. That's generous of them, she said finally. I hope they run it honestly. Soon looked at her mother across the table and said nothing for a moment, holding her cup with both hands the way she always held things she was not yet ready to put down. You were remarkable, she said. At Markham, the whole room felt it. Bernice made a small, dismissive sound with her teeth that meant she had heard the compliment and was choosing not to accept it, which was what she always did with compliments, and which soon had stopped arguing with many years ago. I said what I'd been thinking, Bernice said. That's all it was. Outside, a streetcar passed 2 blocks over on the main road, its familiar sound carrying through the October night the way sounds carry clearly in that season. The city moving through its ordinary rhythms, indifferent to any single story, and, despite that indifference, still holding. The yellow curtains Bernice had sewn herself, the year they moved into the house, shifted in the small draft from the window she always left open a crack, even in autumn. The ceramic pot on the stove was the same one that had belonged to her husband's mother, and it had produced coffee every morning for 23 years, with the same reliable stubbornness she had always admired in it. Soon watched her mother move to refill the kettle, the same efficient, unself-conscious movement of a woman entirely at home, in a space that belonged to her, and she thought about all the mornings she had woken before dawn in whatever city her work had taken her to that week, and sent her mother a short message, just a word or two, just enough to say, I'm here. She thought about the first apartment she had moved into at 19, and the jar of her mother's soup in the freezer, packed carefully and labeled in Bernice's handwriting, which she had rationed for 4 months because eating it meant it was getting smaller. She thought about the meetings she had left without explanation, on more occasions than she could count, because her mother had called, and her mother did not call unless something genuinely mattered. Bernice set the refilled kettle back on its base and returned to the table. She looked at her daughter in the kitchen light, the daughter she had walked to schools in every morning for 12 years. The daughter she had watched leave for university, with a single bag and a steadiness in her jaw that had made Bernice's chest ache with recognition. And she reached across the small table and covered Soon's hand with her own. "You came," she said. "That morning, you always come." Soon looked at her mother's hand resting over hers, and for a moment she did not trust herself to say anything that would be worth saying, so she simply turned her hand over beneath her mother's and held it. The kettle began to warm on its base. The radio was on low somewhere in the background. The street outside had settled into the quiet of a Tuesday night, the kind of unremarkable, ordinary peace that is easy to overlook when it is simply present, and which, on this particular evening, felt like something that had been carefully, patiently earned.